Good day to all of you, and a big welcome to everybody on this webinar. My name is Charles Nimako. I'm the Country Director for Safe Water Network in Ghana. A very good day to our colleagues in Ghana. Good evening to our colleagues in India. Good morning to our colleagues in the USA. And a good day to everybody that is on this webinar. We're happy to have you join us this morning, this afternoon, this evening for this topic. This is the first webinar in the Innovative Finance for Small Water Enterprise webinar series. This is a critical topic. For Safe Water Network, we're focused on growing the small water enterprise sector and attracting additional finance to the sector. We've realized that getting the right financing and additional financing to the sector is one of the key barriers to scaling up small water enterprises. For over a decade, Safe Water Network has convened stakeholders in person to directly address challenges to the sector. Under COVID-19, we've pivoted to the virtual world, hosting a dozen webinars since March. Building on that momentum, we are launching the Innovative Finance Small Water Enterprise Series, starting with concessional loans. As I mentioned earlier, we identified loans as one of the support arms for scaling up small water enterprises, not financing the enterprises with loans, but blending the grant funding and the philanthropical money with concessional loans to finance the small water enterprises. We'll be getting later on into the detail of how two examples have worked for us in Ghana and also in Cambodia. We hope you enjoyed the discussion, and I look forward to close collaboration going forward as we address this critical and core issue. Again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to a very exciting session and a very participatory session. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, for those welcoming remarks. And thanks to all of you for joining this webinar. My name is Sam Huston. I'm the USAID WashFin Project Chief of Party, and it's my absolute pleasure to be moderating today's webinar. I also wanted to thank Safe Water Network for convening this event and for all the participants who are joining us today for sharing their expertise and enriching the conversation. We're here to talk about innovative financing for safe water enterprises, or SWEs, and we're specifically looking at concessional financing and concessional lending into this space. So definitions are important, and so here's how we're defining the topic of concessional finance. So we're talking about loans and capital investment generally offered at below market rates and conditions, offered with generous payback timeframes and limited currency risks. So why is this important, and why is it important now? There is, as Charles was mentioning up front, there's significant financing gaps for safe water enterprises, and their experience from Ghana and India alone has estimated that over $6 billion is required for investing in this space. Conventional financing, whether it's from development agencies, governments, philanthropists, or impact investors, alone or even together is insufficient to meet the current needs, and new financing is needed. It also provides a great opportunity for the sector to pool resources from private capital so that SWEs can build creditworthiness. SWEs are often serving the bottom of the pyramid, those most in need of new or improved service, and they're often doing this on a basis that's not fully investable on commercial terms. So offering alternatives is critical. Concessional lending can provide a first step on the financing ladder for small water enterprises, and if they manage those concessional loans well, it perhaps can position them better to attract blended or more commercial oriented financing in the future. So for today's session, moving into the next slide that has the agenda, we're going to have a fireside chat, then we're going to have a session with a couple of case studies being presented from Ghana and Cambodia. We'll have next a panel discussion with some actors that are busy in this space. And finally, we'll wrap up with some summary and takeaways before we have concluding remarks. Before we get into the main thrust of the program today, I did want to cover a few housekeeping issues. The chat function has been turned off on our technology today. We do encourage participants to use the question and answer function for any questions they have. And please do get those questions in early as panelists and presenters are speaking so that we can respond to those in a timely manner immediately following those presentations and discussions. Also, the webinar will be recorded and Safe Water Network will be hosting the final video in the coming days. And to save time, we won't be going through detailed introductions for all the participants, but we encourage you to look at the landing page where a link is being shared so that you can see everyone's bios from the presenters. And finally, we won't be going through a whole lot of detail about how to define what a SWE is, but that information's also been provided on the landing page with the links being provided. So without further ado, we'd like to get into the first session of the program today, which is the fireside chat being held by Souraya and Chris. So Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Sam, and welcome everybody. Souraya, good to see you again. So we know,
Hi, everyone.
Souraya, we know the Stone Family Foundation takes a real entrepreneurial approach to philanthropy and has a real heavy focus on water and sanitation. So it seems perfect to talk to you about innovative financing and concessional loans. I wonder if we could just jump right in and perhaps you could share with us a brief summary of the concessional loans that the foundation has already participated in.
Yeah, sure. There are two examples that I can share now. The first one is an initiative that we call the Cambodia Revenue Finance Facility. And so this is an initiative under which we are partnering with a Cambodian bank, which is called BIDC, and an organization called GREPS, who is our technical partner on the ground. And through this partnership, what we're doing is providing a package of support to piped water operators in Cambodia. And part of this is finance, and part of this is wraparound business support. So in terms of the finance that we're providing, it takes the form of revenue finance. And that is a bit different from a traditional loan in the sense that there isn't a fixed interest rate and there isn't a fixed term. So the goal is for the operator to achieve a multiple of the principal amount. So for example, 1.3 times the principal amount. And once this is achieved, that's when the lending ends. And in terms of the repayments themselves, it's also a bit different in the sense that it's not based on a fixed interest rate, but actually on a percentage of revenues. And that was interesting for us because it means that the level of repayment is aligned with the seasonal variations in revenues, which is something that we see a lot in these types of businesses. So when the revenues are high in the dry season, for example, the operator pays more, and when the revenues drop in the rainy season, the operator pays less. And so in addition to this finance that we're facilitating, we also provide other forms of business support. So this can include technical support, for example, and that can be feasibility studies or technical drawings for stations, but also support with sales and the promotion of household connections. And this really serves a dual purpose. So on the one hand, it helps achieve the social impact, but it also helps the operator increase their revenues, which means that they can also repay the loan faster. So that's one example. The other concessional loan that I can talk about now is a loan that we've provided to another organization in Cambodia that's called K-Wash. And what they do is that they acquire piped water stations, they upgrade them, and they run them. They currently have a portfolio of 5 stations. And the finance that we provide here is closer to a standard loan, but the interest rate is below market rates, and there's also an initial grace period for capital repayments. So yeah, these are the two examples that I can share for the moment that we have in our portfolio.
Yeah, Souraya, really interesting. On one hand, it sounds like the foundation is providing a bit of a safety net or room for the operator to participate in their conventional financing, but then have this safety net that you're providing. Is that a bit of the strategy?
Yeah, I guess is trying to find a structure that is more flexible, that is well suited to their business model, and also provide some additional support to help them roll out the strategy and really make the best of this finance that's been provided.
Yeah. So when the foundation moved into these examples and these particular cases, what was the strategic look? Why go into the concessional loan world? Was there something particular that you're hoping to see come out of this? Is there a strategic focus? What did you hope to find, and what are you hoping to find for the future?
Yeah, I mean, the reason we considered concessional loans for these 2 cases is that really it seemed to be well suited to the needs of the businesses, and it seemed to be a good tool to help them achieve their strategy and also achieve the social impact that was attached to this. So if we look at the Cambodia Revenue Finance Facility, for example, and the water operators, it became apparent that a revenue finance model actually could make sense, because these are operators that can actually afford a loan. They're financially viable. They recover both their OPEX and CAPEX costs. But because of the nature of their business, they face specific challenges such as seasonal variations in revenue or long repayment timeframes, which means that they often struggle to access traditional bank loans. But as a foundation, we're well placed to help them access finance that's more flexible, that's more patient, better suited to their needs. And so what we were hoping for here, our goal was both to help them achieve social impact by helping them move towards universal access, universal coverage in their license area, but also to become financially stronger so that they continue to deliver the service in the longer term. With regards to K-Wash, it's also a financially sustainable business, so it makes sense to provide a loan because they can afford it. But it's also, yeah, it's in line with their strategy. Really what they're trying to achieve is to acquire new stations. They want to act as an aggregator in the sector to eventually reach a scale that can be attractive to scale financiers. And in our view, that was a strategy that made sense. And really our goal by providing this loan was to help them to get to that scale and to the stage that they need to. So this is what we were hoping for.
Yeah, it seems like a super unique opportunity, especially coming from the foundation. I want to ask you about what your thoughts are with regard to the potential for concessional loans. But before I do, maybe could you help the audience with a couple of the terms you used? Revenue finance model. So very specific term that you used, but it also led to what was probably fundamental in your assessment of whether this was a good candidate for a concessional loan. What do you mean by a revenue finance model and what that might mean to the audience?
Sure. So revenue finance means that the repayments are not based on a fixed interest rate, but on a percentage of revenues. So instead of paying every month a fixed rate, basically the repayments will vary every month based on the level of revenues. So because they're paying a percentage of revenues, the higher the revenues, the higher the payment, and vice versa. So it also means that there's no fixed term. So, you know, because they have to, the aim is really to achieve a multiple of the principal amount. It can take, you know, 5 years, it can take 10 years, but yeah, they have the flexibility also. They have more flexibility on timeframes, and it'll take the time it takes to get there. But yeah, it's so it's quite well suited to businesses that have seasonal variations in revenues, but also that have long payback periods.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. So what do you see as the role, and perhaps with your early steps, the potential for concessional loans with regard to small water enterprises? Do you have an outlook for that?
Yeah, I think concessional loans do have a role to play, definitely in the SWE sector, because I think the sector is at a stage where it needs finance that is flexible and patient, and that is what a concessional loan can offer. So flexibility on returns or on timeframes or on other aspects. That being said, I think we might want to keep in mind that while concessional loans are likely to be useful, they're probably always going to be one part of the finance that's needed by SWEs. And I think there are two main reasons for this. The first one is that not all SWEs can actually afford a loan, even if it is concessional. So a loan will only make sense where the enterprise has broken even, at least on an operational basis. So that's the case with the pipe water operators in Cambodia that we just mentioned. They're financially sustainable, their business models are quite mature, well established. They're quite close to a more traditional utility model. So there's not a lot of innovation needed there. But if we look at our portfolio, actually we see that a lot of the SWEs haven't really reached that stage yet. They're, and I think that's in part because of the nature of the organizations. They're high impact organizations, they're trying to serve the BOP, they're using more innovative models. So they're more at a stage where they're still iterating their business model. They're trying to identify reliable revenue streams. They're trying to navigate a complex operating environment. And really in that context, a loan doesn't really make sense. And this is why it's very likely that grants will probably still be needed for a while in the SWE sector to really help the enterprises get to the stage where they can reach break even and get to that point. And I think the second reason is that although concessional loans can be useful, it's not necessarily the right type of finance for some of the SWEs to actually break even and scale. So again, if we look at the SWEs in our portfolio, what's becoming apparent is that quite a few of them now are looking at a different pathway to scale, which involves securing a government contract. So this is where a mandated authority is paying the SWE to provide and deliver the services. So in that instance, what's needed to break even and scale is public finance. So this is another example. So I think, that's something we need to keep in mind when we think about the future financing needs of SWEs. Although concessional loans are likely to be needed, and we can also expect that need to grow over time as the enterprises become more mature and more financially viable, it's likely that it's always going to be only one part of the finance that's needed.
Yeah. Souraya, thanks for sharing your experience. Of course, thank you for the work of the Stone Family Foundation. And it's obvious that there are a number of conditions that investors or foundations would look at to see whether this is an appropriate fit. But it's a very interesting and obviously a growing part of the complete finance package of SWEs. So really great to talk to you. Good to see you. And Sam, we'll turn it back to you.
Chris and Souraya, thanks for that. That was a very interesting conversation, lots of nuance and good content there. So thanks for taking us through that. So we will now be transitioning into some case study presentations. First, Charles is going to be presenting the Safe Water Network experience from Ghana, and then we'll be hearing from Julien about his work in Cambodia. So we'll have two back-to-back 7-minute presentations here, followed by 10 minutes of questions and answers from the audience. So I would like to encourage you again, if you've got questions during the presentation, please get those in as soon as you've got them so that we can get to them immediately after the presentations without delay. Charles, over to you. We look very much forward to your presentation, and then we'll proceed straight to Julien. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sam. And again, hello to everybody. Charles Nimako here again, as Sam has briefly mentioned. In Ghana, we've had experience with a couple of concessionally loans, and I think I'll do some few presentations on how those loans are fed and the lessons that we've learned from those two loans. First of all, before I even get into the details of the loans, let me talk a little bit about the Safe Water Network home model that we apply in Ghana. Safe Water Network, as you may already know, is a small water enterprise that operates in Ghana and India. In Ghana, we have 96 stations. Actually, we still have 4 under construction. So by the end of this year, we should have about 100 stations, 7 over 130 communities in Ghana. We are reaching a population of over 400,000 people. We operate water kiosks. We also do household connections from micro utilities that source water from surface or groundwater. We believe that innovation is required to solve big problems like closing the funding gap, scaling small water enterprises to achieve universal access to safe water. And that's the reason why we've leveraged our portfolio to experiment with loans, to generate learnings, deepen our understanding of how innovative finance can play a role in our sector, and share those learnings with others in the sector. Our typical community size is between 3,000 and 5,000, average about 4,500 people. And as I mentioned, we source our water either from underground or from surface dams, lakes, rivers, and what have you. The technologies that we apply are slow sound filtration with chlorination. We use solar in most of our stations. We started with grid power, but as I will get through in my presentation later on, the grid power was costing us quite a bit. So now we're transitioning most of our stations to solar, using the grid as backup power. In terms of distribution, we have household connections, public standpipes, 7 are the source of the treatment. Our water system, or our water, is branded as home water. I think you can see it on the logo in the photo. We try to maintain affordability, inclusiveness, and everything. So we're selling our water about 10 pesos, which is less than 2 US cents for a 20-liter bucket. It costs roughly $100,000, about almost 600,000 Ghana cedis, $100,000 to set up a typical station. And that includes the cost of construction, the distribution network, and a little bit of money, what we call startup capital, to use as working capital for the stations until they reach a stage where they can start breaking even and generating enough funds to cover their own costs. So roughly the unit cost per person is about $200 per person. Downtime is 5%, and in most cases, we even do better than that. Because especially when you have household connections, water should be available 24 hours because people demand water at different times of the day. So your downtime should be approaching 0 in that instant. In terms of the loan, the micro utility loan that we took, the first one that I'm going to talk to you about, the original loan was intended for one station because we took a loan to support one station, and later on we leveraged some grant funding to spread it to 2 stations with an increase in population, and also to de-risk the investment. Obviously, the more communities you can spread the loan over, the higher the revenues, the better the margins, so you can afford to pay your loans. We also found out that the stations did not perform at our original projection. You know, just like any loan product, we do an initial projection, revenues, costs, margins, surpluses, what have you. But after we use that as a basis to get the loan. So as you can see, the original loan amount was 67,000, which was about 355,000 Ghana cedis then. Interest rate was pegged at 10%. Even though interest rate was pegged at 10%, it was about half, less than half what the going rate was for commercial loans. We fixed the term at 14 years with 2 years of moratorium. And then obviously with a fixed interest rate and a fixed term, the repayments were fixed. So every year you need to come up, or every month, these were being paid quarterly, you need to come up with the quarterly payments. We found out that the stations were not performing at our original projections. Some of the reasons being that electricity costs became very high. The government utility started increasing electricity costs, and also low collection rates. You know, at this stage, we're doing manual billing. You bill people who use the water in their homes, and then you go around again to collect the bills. The collection rates were very low. And then there were other costs that come in as you start running these stations. So we went back to the drawing board and said that what are some of the issues that have caused us to sort of not being able to properly or adequately service the loan. So we revised the projections based on what we know. We used a blended finance approach to reduce the total cost of the principal and offset that with grant funding. We went back to the lender and negotiated a reduced interest rate of 2%. And then at the end of the day, we also use an income participation approach. So instead of having a fixed payment rate and a fixed tenor of the loan, we went in for revenue sharing, if you would, whereas 60% of the surpluses will go towards the servicing of the loan. And as I mentioned, with the revised loan terms, we're able to reduce the ratio of debt to capital expenditure by increasing the grant funding component of the loan and then making it easier to service that loan. The commitment to loan repayment forces us to maximize our operational efficiency through innovations like solar and prepaid meters. You know, in the small water enterprise segment here, where we serve mainly suburban, peri-urban and rural enterprises, pricing is key in the sense that we want to price low enough for people to be able to afford the water, but you also want to price in a way that you can cover your costs. However, you know, you don't have the pricing power that a normal commercial enterprise without competition might have. So we have to manage our costs. We need to get the cost down to improve the margins so we can adequately service the loan. The first problem that we faced was that the 26%, we experienced a 26% higher operating cost than what we expected. And the solution, or one of the solutions, was we installed solar panels. As I mentioned, electricity cost was costing us quite a bit. So we got some funding to convert the stations to solar, which brought down the cost of the electricity significantly. And not only did it bring down the cost of electricity, it also gave us stable power, because as you know, some of the power, the quality of the power in some of these rural communities are not the best. So, but with solar panels, we're able to get some stable power, which also help maintain the integrity of some of the electronic equipment. We reduced electricity costs per liter, and then we decided to actually expand the solar installation to 62% of the stations that we're currently operating. One other learning was that 66% of the 66% collection rate. The bills that we're sending out, we're only collecting 66% of it. And there's not many organizations that you lose 34% of your revenues and then you'll be able to stay in business. So what we did was we installed prepaid meters at the standpipes and at the household. As we speak now, almost all our household connections are on prepaid meters, electronic prepaid meters that consumers can recharge using their mobile money wallets, or they can go to the station, pay cash to the operator. They get a token which they can use to recharge their meters. So we did away with the manual collection process, and that increased the collection rate to between 95% and 100%. And even in some cases over 100%, because people might pay in advance before they even use the water. So there were a couple of takeaways from that we got before we sort of used it to get to the second loan that we applied for. I mean, some of the takeaways is that blended finance and income participation can be inclusive. Loans can spur innovation. And the lessons from this that we applied to the 2019 loan, the second loan that we took, was now we've extended the period of loans for unforeseen events. We've spread the loans over multiple stations. We've used historical data to select stations with a higher return. And one key learning is the loans have to be denominated in local currency. Of course, we are selling for local currency. And if you go for dollar loan, the currency devaluation and things can really hurt you. So those were some of the learnings that we used to get to use for our next loan. But with COVID-19 and threat from climate change and economic downturn have even reinforced the need for universal, safe, affordable water. Safe Water Network will continue to act as a testing ground to pilot innovative finance mechanisms and share learnings for the sector. Some of the activities we've planned for 2021 include experimentation with loans for scale, loan agreements that leverage small loans to attract more debt, social impact measurement and analysis to crowd in resource-based financing, methods to identify the most vulnerable customers and disseminate subsidies, and leveraging technology to experiment with micro price increases. I think I'm going to pause here.
Thank you very much, Charles. We'll take questions at the end and we'll move on to Julien's presentation at this point. Julien, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Happy to be here, and thanks for Safe Water Network for giving me the time. So I will very briefly introduce you to 1001 Fontaine. So we'll move to next slide, please. So what you see here is one of the 250 water kiosks that we operate in Cambodia. The 1001 Fontaine is a social business, and we provide safe drinking water for the vulnerable. So the way it works is that we build local micro production that are decentralized in rural areas of Cambodia, and we empower local entrepreneurs to manage it. So the water is sold at a very low price. We are talking about 1.5 cents per liter. So we make sure that it's affordable for all the population, and local entrepreneurs are trained to produce, distribute, but also empower the local population to and bring awareness to them. So we act sort of as a franchising organization, and the economic model behind all that is all the initial capex to launch those water kiosks, those stations, to build the facility, train the entrepreneurs, etc., is subsidized by grants or philanthropic money. And the operating expenses, so all the costs and the P&L of the entrepreneurs, are self-financed by the sales of water. And these entrepreneurs are supported by a local platform that is a national organization that provides technical assistance, water quality, maintenance, etc. And this franchise organization gets a fee from the entrepreneurs to cover its costs. So as such, we have an hybrid economic model whereby all philanthropy provides the initial the cost, and then it's subsidized. And today in Cambodia, we are impacting 800,000 people that are drinking safe water on a daily basis, and we've created 800 sustainable jobs. And today we cover 25% of rural Cambodia, so we are actually the largest safe drinking water producer in the country. And we have raised about 15 million euros grants, and this year, 2020, is a fundamental year for us because the whole organization will reach financial break-even. So there won't be any need for additional subsidy for the system to work. So that puts us, I would say, in a fantastic position to envision scale and acceleration of our impact. So we've set up a new business plan for the next years ahead, which basically consists in doubling our impact in the next 4 years and tripling the impact by 2030. And the way we aim to finance that is through a blended finance approach. So we will basically use and leverage concessional loans to accelerate the development of our water kiosks. So we are going to raise 2 to 3 million euros basically to launch additional kiosks and I would say meet our acceleration targets, but we will still rely on loans and subsidies for other programs, including the capacity building, the innovation, because we still need to innovate on the areas of digital marketing, etc. And for that, subsidies will still be needed. And we'll also have some social programs, for example, Save Water for Schools. So we have set a new economic model, but basically the key objective behind that is to guarantee that we will maintain our development paths and secure our growth strategy in the future. Moving to next slide, please. So based on that, we defined a new business plan last year, and we decided to get to the market to find new sources of financing. So I'll just tell you in a very concrete way how we felt this experience with 4, I would say, key example. The first thing is that we went to I would say traditional funder. So we went to a development agency and they told us basically you are much too small now to get subsidies, and you're too big to get subsidies and too small to get traditional commercial loans that are more for bigger infrastructure. So they told us basically we're in the Death Valley and we have no solution for us. That was an see the impact investment, and they told us basically it's very interesting, we are super excited, but we are going to expect a 10% return. So it wasn't possible for us due to the I would say the social mission we had, because we'd have to triple the price of water. So we found out ourselves, I would say, in a very difficult situation, and we got stuck. So it took us a lot of time, actually 6 months, to fine-tune the value proposition and find the right organizations to support us, because as was said before by Charles, we need to have a level of loans and conditions that maintain the social mission. And we actually managed, after 6 months of discussion, to break a deal with BNP Paribas, which is the second biggest European bank in terms of net asset. And basically, we convinced them to support us and lend us $800,000. So it's about a third of what we're looking for in terms of loans for the next year ahead. And we managed to negotiate some very interesting deals in terms of interest rates, below 2% interest rate. We had a 2-year grace period without guarantees. So it's quite a good deal for us. And what convinced them is obviously not, I would say, the financial incentive, but it's the social impact we are creating. So we put the impact we are creating on health, on the environment through the emission of carbon credits, and also on the economic development with the economic return. And that basically managed to convince them to support them. So we co-built the solution because there was nothing on the shelf available at their bank. So it was quite a fun story. And the next move now is to work with historical partners that have been funding us through grants. I'm talking about the Stone Family Foundation, the Vitol Foundation, for example, and they are working with us to de-risk the investment. So they are now open to support us in the years ahead, not only through concessional loans, but also through a blend of loans and philanthropy. And in it that way, we will combine the two sources of finance to secure our development. So that's an important step ahead. And just to conclude, not only do we need concessional loans to secure our growth, but more strategically, we see it as a way to convince not only loaners, lenders, but also the governments and the development agency to amplify the long-term financial support. Because as Souraya was saying before, obviously concessional loans will not be enough and sufficient to bring the financial gap to expand and scale the safe water enterprise sector. And by showing and demonstrating that this is a sustainable and viable model to invest on, and the money can be safely, I would say, placed on this business, then probably we will convince institutional funders and big investors to enter this market, because again, $6 billion is a very significant amount, and concessional loans will not be alone. So we can create sort of a leverage effect and positive traction to bring on new investors, international aid, and public governments to invest in this sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julien. Very interesting presentation, and likewise, Charles, from you. We've got a few questions coming in from the audience that I'm looking forward to getting to in the next few minutes. So maybe briefly, Charles, to you first, and then Julien. What the first question is around the regulatory landscape. What's the regulatory landscape look like in Ghana and then in Cambodia? Is there a regulator? And how does that kind of impact oversight and accountability for your activities? Charles?
Sam, yes, in terms of the regulatory environment, the regulator has not laid out specific requirements and regulations for concessional loans. It's one of the areas we're working in is policy influence, advocacy, and things like that we can clearly define some of the requirements and the terms of concessional loans and blended financing for the small water enterprise sector. We are taking the lead in that aspect, and we are sharing our learnings with the industry, and our expectation is that the learnings and the steps and some of the requirements will be built into the new water sector policy that is being formulated now in Ghana.
Julien?
Well, in Cambodia, let's put it that way. Safe water enterprise are in a gray zone, okay? So it's not officially recognized by the government like a utility, okay? It's not. So we operate, sort of under the radar. So we have, I would say, the biggest water rural producer MOU with the government, and we operate under an MOU, but obviously it's not being recognized as one of the components of the national wash policy. And this is what all the advocacy work is about. And I guess, Charles, you have the same objective, is basically to position water kiosks, small water enterprise, as part of the wash policy with clear regulation, with clear enforcement by the government. Because what's happening, and I'm not even talking about finance here, but just what's happening is that there are multiple players, mostly family players, that are now operating without any license, without any control by the government, and therefore that are not solving the problem at all. So our role, and we see, I guess, Safe Water Network and 1001 Fontaine being sort of leaders in that spectrum, are not looking for a monopoly and being the only providers, but sort of being a special role to push the government to keep the standard of quality very high, and to create sort of a market that will enable actors to spread out and therefore increase the overall health in the country.
Thank you, Julien. Maybe just sticking with you for the next question, and then we'll hear from Charles. Briefly, what do you see as the role for venture capital in supporting SWEs?
I think, it really depends on the stage of maturity we're in. If you take a rural example, okay, I guess venture capital will probably be useful when we've reached a certain level of maturity and commercial viability. So venture capital will definitely be instrumental to scale, basically. And as I said before, demonstrate the commercial viability of our products. But let's be honest with ourselves. In a rural poor context, it takes some time, and it takes some time to position the business. If you talk more in a urban or peri-urban context, then we can probably imagine that's what we are doing doing in Vietnam, for example. We are launching a project in Vietnam to address poor people in a urban, much denser density. And in that case, we are starting with venture capital from start and equity through Danone Communities and an impact investment boutique called Colam Impact. So again, that's really depend. My answer will be it's always a question of balance between the social impacts you want to have and the economic return. But you need to be patient and analyze each situation differently. There is no one single solution. And obviously venture capital can play a role depending on the level of maturity of the program and who we're trying to address.
Charles?
Yes, I would agree with Julien on several scores. Taking the Ghana example, venture capital looks at returns and exit strategies and things like that. For a sector like us, with limited pricing power, with operating in the rural areas, with very low margins, and in some cases the market is it's not that big enough for commercial enterprises. It becomes very difficult to attract direct venture funds into this sector. There are other aspects of the business. For example, if you look at the various parts of the business, there's some of it. Some of the value, what they call the value chain aspect of the business, where we can disaggregate and maybe have venture capitalists be interested in that part. For example, you can have a purely commercial operation doing distribution. You can have a commercial operation doing household connections. Those can be disaggregated and charged at commercial rate, while the treatment and the management and even the management piece of it, you can get a private enterprise or a private organization taking care of it. But as a whole, looking at venture capital, I think the segment is still in its infancy. We have to prove profitability. We have to prove sustainability. We have to prove non-interference from the government, if you would, because the government in most cases is the biggest operator in the water segment, to give comfort to future venture capitalists before they come in. These are all part of the advocacy work that we're doing. Get government, get all the different actors, get the scale players to make the landscape attractive, first for private PPP players, and then obviously for venture capital players. But there's some aspect of it that venture capital can come in, not the traditional venture capital that we know. For example, we're looking at output-based financing. We're also looking at blended capital, where you look for philanthropic funds and then you blend that with loan funds. So there's several aspects of financing that may mirror venture capitalism, but it's not directly the traditional venture capital that we know of.
Thank you, Charles. Trying to squeeze in as many of these questions as I can. This one's for Julien. The question from the audience is, how do you demonstrate social impact in your water service? Is it self-reporting, customer surveys? What's your approach there?
Well, it's enrooted in our operational KPIs that we monitor on a daily basis, I would say, because we look at basically the number of customers, and all the KPIs we monitor actually track an economic performance as well as a social impact. That's the first element. In addition to that, we operate on a very continuous basis specific studies to evaluate different dimensions. For example, we did a study with the UNFCCC about the carbon credit avoidance, and that led us to conclude that our project was, I would say, positive. We also did a study back in 2014 on absenteeism at school. It was a 2-year study that demonstrated that we decreased absenteeism by 75%. So it's, and we also did studies on the affordability part, etc. So it's basically a blend of operational KPIs and ad hoc studies to make sure that we explore all the areas of social impact and we integrate that into our M&E.
Thank you very much, Julien and Charles, for your presentations and your back and forth on the questions and answers. I do apologize to the audience. We weren't able to get to all the questions, but the show must go on. We have a very interesting panel discussion coming up. And once again, Julien and Charles, thank you very much for your inputs. And I will now be handing over to Harold, who's going to be moderating the next panel discussion. Over to you, Harold. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam. And we've had a lot of very interesting stuff from Julien and from Charles. And we are building on it and finding out what we can do to help improve innovative financing. Leslie, the first question will go to you. It's clear, it's very obvious from the discussions that we have had so far that innovative financing for small water enterprises is key. We know that you have done a paper on mobilizing financing for WASH. Where will you see concessional loans falling in? How would it fall in place to ensure that we're able to get these innovative finances to help small water enterprises, bearing in mind some of the things that they've talked about regulation, where in some instances it's like government, there's no real regulation. How do you see innovative financing in the sector? Over to you, Leslie.
Yes, and thank you. I want to also first thank Safe Water Network for inviting me to participate in this panel in this really important discussion. And it was really interesting to hear several of the different innovations that are happening so far. I wanted to sort of kick off these reflections and comments with the idea that this is a spectrum, and this has been emphasized by Souraya first off, and then followed by Julien and also yourself. There is a spectrum here, and I think we can all understand the potential that comes here from safe water enterprises as being an extension of utilities, of being able to move further faster than in-ground pipe networks, and the advantages that those pose. I think what many of us within the water and sanitation community have been saying for some time is that the ideal or North Star that we're looking for is commercial loans. But in many cases where people are starting, you can't go from 0 to 100, right? There are many steps along the way, hence that spectrum, and that concessional loans are one very important critical step along that pathway. But it's also important to remember at the same time that while we're focused on bringing that private or commercial finance into the financing options and arrays, that this isn't going to be the exact fit everywhere for every situation, and that it will be very dependent upon context. And governments, when they're looking at how they're going to solve water and sanitation access across their country for their entire population, need to develop a comprehensive plan and strategy, right? They need to be able to recognize that commercial finance isn't going to apply everywhere, and respect where it will and won't, and really understand where their public finance needs to be allocated, so that they can differentiate where they should be targeting concessional loans and also their private loans. And then at the same time, while they're sort of allocating, segmenting their country as a sector, they need to look very critically at their rules, at their regulations, as you were just asking, to understand, are there small adaptations that we can make to encourage investment? And maybe I should have taken a step back to say they should look at some places. It's obvious commercial finance may not go, but in some places maybe it could go, and why isn't it right now? And what do we need to do internally from an enabling environment perspective to really invite and encourage? Water.org has actually had a few different examples where this has played out really nicely in India and is also under development in the Philippines. So there's a number of different points here. I'll stop there, and I can always step back in later.
Thank you very much, Leslie. That's very interesting. In fact, there are more areas that we can immediately move to, but our time is not really on our side. So we'd like to move to Rina. We'll come back to you, Leslie, but Rina, for now, we want to know UBS. What is the role that UBS is playing when it comes to concessional financing? We've heard a lot, and Leslie has set the tone very beautifully. One of the things which was mentioned by Charles in response to one of the questions is the issue of sustainability and profitability. Enlighten us on what some of the things that you look out for, the key criteria for borrowers to be able to obtain finance from UBS. And yeah, basically just let us know some of the key things that you look out for, bearing in mind some of the challenges that they have mentioned earlier on. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. And thank you for having me here. As many of you know, UBS is the largest global wealth manager in the world. So we manage around 2.6 trillion of assets on behalf of our clients globally. In terms of financing, UBS also curate the largest philanthropist community in the world. Over 400 families are part of our network. And what we do in terms of, trying to finance this kind of projects, we go with a different approach, right? Might not be the regular bank where you can go and get a loan, but the way that we do it is we try to educate our clients in how, for example, blended finance work and introduce new instruments of financing. We heard a lot from the other panelists and specific from the projects that were presented, how difficult it is to get the loan and how are the challenges just to get that financing to you. And when we look at that, you need to start looking also how the financing is segmented, right? The amount of money that you're going to need, but also in which country where you are allocating the money. So in the way that we're trying to, speak capital to this type of project is taking a more holistic approach. First, we want to educate investors that water has a cost, which probably people don't even talk about it. When you ask someone and you ask one of our clients or investors, how much does it cost for you to open the faucet and to, brush your teeth, right? And let it run for 2 minutes, which is basically, a lot of water going down. Most of the people can tell you how much the water really costs, right? So one part is as educating clients that water has a cost, and it costs in different places. It could go from 2 cents and it could go to $15, the same gallon, depending where you are at. The second part that we want to educate clients also in terms of understanding what the financing is needed is the cost of inaction. If you don't invest on water and then you don't look into water projects to be part of your portfolio, actually you have a cost that is going to be reflected in some of your investments, right? So when you diversify your investment and you don't do and take actions in specific regions where is the lack of water, you might have actually an economic impact into your portfolio. And the third part that we actually like to talk is also about the economic benefits. And this is in a larger scale. It's not only about the economic benefit of giving communities access to water or to create more jobs or, or the return that you can have, but actually how water is linked to other social challenges or environmental challenges that we're seeing and that might have an economic benefit for you. For example, people don't talk about the link of water to gender equality. People don't used to talk about probably about the impact of water on education, on gender equality specifically having access to sanitation and having access to water will let actually for girls and women to have a different role in their communities. Up until now, women and girls are still carrying most of the world's drinking water into different places, and you might know this. But also on an education point of view, if kids don't have access to water, so schools don't have access to water, kids will be missing an important part of their education, and communities cannot grow and cannot contribute to the economic benefits that we're talking about. So when we're thinking about financial models, and I know we're focusing a lot on the concessional financing today, but I want to also to open up the idea of having a more innovative way on how we can do it. The projects talk about blended finance. How do we get there? How will we get capital actually that is basically, I will say, a no cost to support and to mitigate the risk of a project. When we look into projects, and this is not only specific for the water sector, but it is we have different criteria that we look. One is the intensity of the investment that we're doing, the initial investment. And we know from water projects that basically you're going to have a J curve. It's going to be cash negative in the first years because it's very intense to do it. We also going to look at low sector rate of return, which in this environment, basically, I will say it doesn't matter at this point. Any kind of return right now could be good for anyone. But also we talk about the foreign exchange risk. How is the mismatch between the local currency and the earnings on the foreign currency? So we need to also to look into those, but also on the risk of the political pressure and contracts and the tariff that we're managing different sectors. And this is where organizations like UBS can come in and basically play a different role. They're not only giving you the money and financing, but perhaps partnering with governments around the world, as we have been doing in the last year through one initiative that has been launched by the Secretary General of the United Nations, which is basically to speed the private capital into the SDGs. And I'm co-leading one task force that is basically looking into innovative financing and how can we basically work with governments to lower the country risk. When you look into financing projects, you will have the amount and the country risk are the two elements that we look at. And something that you don't have in control as a SWEs is basically the country risk. It's little that you can do how agencies are rating a country. But if we as an institution can basically work with governments and work on incentive and basically mitigate part of that risk as well, introducing some of the new financing, what we have been seeing venture philanthropy, which could be a very suitable kind of capital that could be introduced in a way. And the second part that we see is venture for impact. So we talk about, somebody talk about venture capital and not being ready, but there is a new wave of investors that are actually looking into innovation. So how can we match those needs with the innovation part? And I think in the role that we see it as well is introducing new instruments. And we have been very successful on creating in the first development impact bond that focus on education with the Indian government and USAID. And basically the risk capital is provided by USAID and our investors. And then we make sure as an organization that the projects are being monitored, are being implemented, and that we have the rate success that is needed for the Indian government to pay back. And we have 120% of return on those projects. So you think about the models and how we can educate our investors and say, look, these are the risks that we need to look at. We as an organization are going to make sure that these projects are going to go ahead and implement it. And then you will get the return that you need. It's still lower return compared to markets, but it's still a very good model that I encourage everyone to look at. And I guess that's basically more or less and how we see it today. And with COVID, what we see is that also the incentive for governments, and this is probably important for everyone looking for money now, that 30% of the incentive that governments are putting out there are going to have some sort of link to sustainability. So if anything that the pandemic had showed us is basically that we have to have be focusing more on social, on environmental impact.
Thank you very much, Rina. And this is really a total holistic approach in addressing the issues. And I like the link you brought to the Sustainable Development Goals, because that's critical for us in anything that we decide to do now. We should look at how we are getting water to everybody and bringing in gender equality, education, all of that. That's been very interesting. And one of the things for those who are not aware, I just want to emphasize on that. A gallon of water can cost as much as 2 cents to $15, depending on where you are and how you are getting access to the water. The first time I got that data, it blew my mind. I mean, working in the sector, this is what you are doing. You have absolutely no idea what it actually means in different places. And you find out that within countries, you have that same kind of disparity. And if you have anything that you want to do, you have to consider that. We want to move on to Ella immediately. We know that USAID is one of the largest funders in the WASH sector. What do you see as development partners, development agencies? What role should we play as development partners in increasing or deploying concessional loans for small water enterprises across board? What are the various things that we should look at? And some of the things have already come up when we are talking about the environment. They've mentioned it, the regulatory environment, with the two examples we heard from Julien and from Charles. Virtually, we have a virgin environment when it comes to regulation of small water enterprises. What should development agencies look at? Tariff structure, what are the various things that should be looked at? Ella, over to you.
Thanks so much, Harold, and really enjoyed Rena's and Leslie's interventions. So in terms of your question, there are a lot of ways to answer it. So let me just focus on three things. The first one really is more on the environment question that you asked or that you mentioned. Second one is more along the lines of the importance of TA. And the third one is just some thoughts in terms of the actual title of the webinar, which is on concessional loans and what's been our thinking around that. So I'll start with the first one, which is really looking at the importance of nurturing the environment for innovative finance. And environment, loosely defined, it could be policy, environment, regulatory, legal, that allow for other providers to participate and provide water services. And it's really interesting that the World Bank came out with a paper. I think I see Bill Kingdom in the Q&A there. So co-authored that paper in 2019 on really looking at citywide water supply. And it's similar to what USAID put forth recently in our technical brief. So we came up with a series of briefs to actually help drive and influence the way our different missions or USAID offices around the world program their WASH funds. And it's important for us to set that forth at the global level and work with our different missions to do that. And part of the idea is, yes, utilities are there. It gets you to scale. There's lots of things you can get with utilities. There's a lot of utility improvement work that we can do, but it's really important to also look at the different kinds of providers that are around and look at it more holistically. And so it's something, at the very least, as a donor agency, it's really important for us to set forth that put forth that guidance, not just for our staff, but also for our implementing partners. And also when we're working with governments. And it's really important to do that because I know that Cambodia, I'm sure you guys are sick of hearing about Cambodia, as that's been mentioned a couple of times. So I won't belabor the example, but it's really important because some of those deals and transactions that you hear about in terms of commercial finance being mobilized in Cambodia is partly because you've got a regulatory frame, you've got a licensing framework, however imperfect it is, that actually allows for a long-term licensing. That allows for private water operators to operate for a longer period of time. And so a lot of times they operate with a lot of uncertainties. And so being able to have a 20-year license is really important. And similarly, you see that in Mozambique, where you've got 1,800 private water providers. Some may not be considered safe water enterprises, some can be. And they basically serve 25% of peri-urban areas. Around Maputo and in larger cities in Mozambique. And a lot of our work in the past 7 to 10 years at USAID has been trying to support the development of a clear licensing and regulatory framework to facilitate the dialogue between different stakeholders with the government, private providers. And it's really important to do that because if they're not part of the fabric of service delivery, it's really hard to scale up. And it's interesting to see what Safe Waters Network has been able to do in India and Ghana in terms of really trying to advocate for that kind of service delivery beyond the pipe, working with urban local bodies, for example, in India. And the second point I wanted to make, and I know I'm probably running out of time, is really investing in TA. And USAID has put forth a strategy, US global strategy, actually, so US government that focuses on governance and finance. But the crux of that is really TA. It's important to help providers improve their credit worthiness, because without being credit worthy, how can you obtain any loans, even if it's below market interest rate loans? And how do we provide TA as a development agency that can help develop a pipeline of investable companies, for instance? And because beyond increasing service provision, it's really important for TA to help build resilience, and it underpin essentially sustainable operations. And one example that we have is we're working right now with the Danone Communities Water Access Acceleration Fund. It's still in initial stages, establishing a TA facility, and USAID has been supporting them in, for example, legal advisory, also hopefully in the future, helping develop that pipeline. And so that's just a couple different examples that we're doing at the moment. And back to the TA, I did want to point out, again, not to belabor the Cambodia example, but it's really important that we were able to help lower the interest rates for some of the private operators in Cambodia through working on business planning and working on improving creditworthiness and reducing collateral requirements for private water operators. And so we're able to help a private operator gain 7.8% for a period of 7 years, for instance. And so those are also some of the ways it's not a concessional loan facility, but we're able to get that from a commercial bank, a local commercial bank. And lastly, I did just want to end with, there's a question about what's USAID's role in accelerating and deploying concessional loans. We're exploring the possibilities. We're not, right now, I'm not saying that we're starting a facility to do that. I think it's really important for governments to be involved in the process and to provide the opportunities to formalize the role of water enterprises. So it goes back to my first point about really having that nurturing environment and get the government and other players to make space, to make it more attractive, as Charles said. And as Leslie said, you can't go from 0 to 100. So there's also, we need to think through how to support them. Maybe we will eventually provide some grants and also concessional loans in the future. And so there's a lot of options for us, and it's definitely a space that we're watching. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll come back to you immediately. Brilliant expose, but one of the things you mentioned was the city-wide water supply, which is brilliant. Leaving no one behind, SDGs, you go to an area, you get everybody to have water. But for example, in India, just like it was mentioned in Ghana and in Cambodia, the regulatory regime is not clear. So if you want the citywide water supply to work and the utility is not getting everywhere, and you have to get some of these SWEs working in peri-urban areas, what are some of the key things that should be put in place to ensure that there's a regulatory framework which would satisfy everything that is necessary so that we have clean, affordable water to everybody citywide? Back to you, Ella.
Such a tough question. I'm not sure I could do justice to that. I mean, I guess to be fair, in terms of what I was saying, in terms of really having the nurturing environment, like you said, it's tough in certain cases. And also, we can't say that a regulatory agency is needed everywhere. Sometimes the context is just not there. It's not appropriate for a certain point in time. So I do want to caveat my comment with that. Where it makes sense or where there's a regulatory agency, I think it's important to work with them to be able to at least develop a framework or at least recognize the existence of these providers. It's like I said before, we've been working in Mozambique for over 7 years, and I'm not saying we have the clearest regulatory and licensing framework yet. We're still operationalizing it. So at the very minimum, it's important to have, depending on the context, a decree or at least a policy statement that outlines the importance of that. So it gets away from regulation, but really more at the policy end. And then you can work on regulation. It could be, I think it was Julien who said something about an MOU. It's hard to say it has to be this way because maybe there isn't a regulatory agency and we don't have all the funding to establish one at the outset. And maybe others can have comments on this as well.
Thank you very much, Ella. So Rina, I want you to come in from where we are leaving And if you want to bring in, you mentioned two new things to many people: venture philanthropy and venture for impact. We are looking at the regulatory framework. If you want to support, again, citywide, what are some of the things when we say venture for philanthropy? Please expound on it a little bit so that we understand. Venture for impact. What are some of the things what exactly is it, and how does it fit into the picture if you want to tackle the situation, maybe municipality-wide or city-wide or whatever? What will you do? What are SWEs supposed to do to access venture for philanthropy or venture for impact?
Yeah,
Rina, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think what I want to say with the venture philanthropy is one of these a school of thought that money can also innovation and support innovation, and in a way that the philanthropy focus more on solving an issue or trying to give money that is really needed. Venture philanthropy will focus on the innovation. So if you have a project that basically will be very innovative, that's where venture philanthropy will come in. And venture for impact, what I've been seeing now is that even institutional investors are creating part of the portfolio to allocate money more towards social or environmental impact. So one of the things that you can think in here is that basically, instead of looking for money that you want to put into the project and give it a return of investment, you will give a return of impact, which is the same ROI, return of investment, but you're going to look for a return of impact. Your metrics are going to go hand in hand with financial return and your environmental or social return. And that's the link that I was talking about, how water touches so many SDGs and so many other problems. If there is no water in communities, we won't be able basically to have education, or we have gender equality, or to support any other businesses. So you have to start thinking about what is the social and environmental impact that my project is having. Some of the examples that we talk about the KPIs and the impact, but I think there is a need to be more demonstrated that the dollar that I'm putting is not only giving me the lower return, but it's giving me a high social or environmental impact. And that's where venture for impact will come, but also impact investors, because that is patient capital. They want to have some sort of return, but more important, the truly impact investors are looking for the social or environmental impact. So those are the models. So focusing not only on the financial return, but focusing on the return of impact.
Thank you very much, Rina. Leslie, our time is almost up. So just a quick, just a simple one, following up on what Rina just said. If you are looking at decentralized solutions for SWEs, can you give us some quick brief, some of the new instruments, some of the quick wins, some of the quick things which can be done based on your experiences on what you have done? If you are getting into a new area, what are some of the quick wins that you can have getting people interested, innovation, to have an impact?
Wow, okay. That's an interesting one to do real fast. I think if you're trying to be new, I think work within your community. I say community, but I mean your network. Who else is already there? Who is already sharing your ideas? Partnerships. These are huge challenges. And not any one of our organizations is actually able to solve these independently, right? So it's really plugging in and sort of knowing who else is active in this space, who else is active in your space exactly right around you. What do you need to do? And that can be other NGOs, that can be other, that can be investors, and that's also your local governments. That's also your local regional development banks or bilateral agencies like USAID. It's really sort of, how do you come together and bring all of your ideas together for larger shared impact?
Thank you very much. This has been a very brilliant session. I've picked a lot of things. And Leslie, Rina, Ella, this very nice gender balanced discussion. We are talking about gender equality. And this panel has all the, I mean, everything has come out brilliantly. And I mean, in the watch sector, I always say it's brilliant when you have people with such knowledge and then the gender aspect. It's been wonderful. So I know going forward, I'm sure we are going to have a huge impact in the sector, looking at what we can do. Sam, our time is up, so over to you. Thank
Harold,
you all.
thank you very much. Leslie, Ella, Rena, well done. Very rich discussion, a lot to digest there. Without further ado, I'm going to be handing over to Oswald, who's going to be giving us some takeaway messages from the discussions and presentations today. Oswald, over to you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, this has been a very engaging and interesting discussion. Thanks to all the participants, brilliant questions. But this is not the end. As I gave out some takeaways, we still need you to participate in determining the shape of this webinar series going forward. And so we're going to launch a pool where we are going to identify potential topics for future webinars, regarding a concessional or innovative financing. And so would like you to take a few seconds just to think about what are some of the topics that could be included to make it complete. I think from the questions that you have been posing, it is, you can turn some of those questions into discussion topics that we could consider going forward. So while you are doing that, I will give you a very quick rundown of the takeaways from the very rich discussions. I don't think I'll do justice from all the very great presentations, experiences that have been shared, but please participate by giving us your suggested topics, potential topics for us to consider going forward. Now, development agencies, both bilateral and multilateral, have multiple roles to play, in innovative financing broadly and concessional loans. But specifically, I want to pick out from the discussion that we have had some of the major elements that need to be considered. Enabling environment is very, very key. I think from the discussions, from the presentations, one could see that the need for very coherent national policies, can make or break investment propositions. Regulations for level playing field and giving space to different providers, to express themselves, to contribute to the huge gap that we see in the access to water and sanitation. But also there is need to include restrictions on tariffs, because some of them, as we have heard, are very excessive, high interest rate, extremely currency depreciations. So development agencies need to participate in de-risking investments, encouraging greater participation of investors, as well as working with governments on realistic tariffs, concession areas, and regulations. Now, depending on the financing product and the context, we have heard that the contexts are very, very different in different countries. So that needs to be taken into account. Development agencies can also play a role of outcome payers, to demonstrate their potential market for the commercial investors. Quite often, for example, MDBs, regional MDBs, if you participate in a deal that already de-risks that deal to a great extent, and it encourages other private investors, other commercial investors to come in. Development agencies can also co-invest with governments and private investors, to support an investment market, as I've just indicated, across the different stakeholders. I think some of the other important takeaways that have come out is that these, particularly the smaller water enterprises, they need hand-holding, to mature them in the loan application. You begin with smaller loans, allowing for innovation, flexibility. There's a lot of innovation out there. We just need to see how can we make it work, how can we make it transparent and foolproof. We also need to understand sometimes the seasonal fluctuations that are there with the access to water, what you see in the different seasons, the consumption of water is different. That needs to be taken into account when crafting these loans. But also, it's very important that we capture these experiences because we need to demonstrate ability. We need evidence, to convince first the policymakers, second, even the consumers. They need to be convinced. They need to know what you are talking about. Let's talk in a language that they are going to appreciate. When you talk about units of water, when you talk about the price of water, do you even understand what that means? Talk in a language that they are going to appreciate. Now, progressive loan acquisition, this is very, very important. Begin with small loans and graduate them into greater loans, and the smaller loans being more concessional, in a local currency, as well as coupled with capacity development of the staff, and we believe that with this concerted effort, with this integrated approach, it's possible, to grow these enterprises into standalone entities that will be able to borrow even at commercial rates. So finally, there is need to synergize among the development agencies, the development partners, those that are on the ground, the government for policy. There is need to understand, have a common understanding of the challenges that are besetting investments in the sector. So stronger collaboration among the development agencies is a must. Okay, I need to stop there and just remind you that please do your pool. It's been launched if you haven't completed it by now. And let me hand over to Sam just to conclude it off. Sam, over to you.
Thank you very much for those concluding takeaway remarks. Just a few concluding remarks from my side. As we've seen today, we're looking for highly localized solutions. Collaboration amongst all development partners and governments is needed. We've covered a lot today, much more than we can cover. Obviously can't cover everything in a 90-minute session, but we've drawn on a lot. As Charles from Safe Water Network said at the beginning of this, this is the beginning of a webinar series to talk through topics. We've solicited your insights on future topics going forward, but we're also going to be putting out a poll here as a call to action to join some advisory type committees focused on financing for safe water enterprises. We do intend to support Safe Water Network's effort to facilitate some more focused discussions and have some bring some more leadership to and sustained attention to some of these topics. And so if this is something that you're interested in, we would very much like to hear from you with this poll here. If you answer yes, we will be reaching out to you. Safe Water Network certainly appreciates your inputs to the convening role that they're proposing around this important topic. So please answer the poll before you sign out. And before we go, I do want to thank Safe Water Network for bringing us all together for this event and focusing in on this important topic. And most importantly, I'd like to thank all of the participants for joining, and likewise, thanks again to all of the panelists and presenters from today. I think we've had a great session. So thank you very much and have a good day, everyone.